I'm asked a lot why I don't talk about politics or social things or really a whole lot about my faith in my business. And I thought it was about time that I addressed it. And over on the TSA Weekly this week, I talked about exactly why I don't do that. But over here on Faith and Focus, I wanted to explain how Faith and Focus came to be and why it is how it is. But before we dive into this, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you never miss a tutorial or upload. Okay, so real talk, I had felt the call, I had felt the pull for a little while that I needed to bring my faith a little bit more to the forefront in my business. And look, I didn't feel comfortable doing it because I had built an audience of people who came to me for a specific reason. They were watching my content mostly for Trello or for other business tools, Canva, things like that. And it didn't feel right to suddenly just start bringing my faith into the conversation. But I couldn't ignore the fact that I felt like God was telling me, yeah, you should be talking about your faith more. Like, I know your faith is present behind the scenes and it shows up in, in my integrity and how I run my business, but it just felt like I needed to be talking about it a little bit more and bringing it forward because being a faith-filled business owner, being a Christian entrepreneur is something that I'm passionate about. And, I started thinking about, well, okay, with the TSA Weekly podcast, was there a way that I could incorporate that in a little bit? It was already diverting from the technical stuff so much. And so I thought, well, maybe there's room in that podcast for this. I thought, maybe I could do like a segment within the podcast and like put chapter marks so that it's easy for people to jump ahead and whatever. And I don't know, that just didn't quite feel right because I felt like, yes, I want to share my beliefs and I want to make it clear how my faith informs my business and how I do things in a certain way because of my faith. But at the same time, it just felt wrong to be kind of force feeding that to people who that's not what they came for. So I gave it some thought. And honestly, this was one of those conversations that I had with Chat GPT about like, okay, I want to bring my faith more into my business. I want to talk about it on the channel. I want to bring it into the podcast or something. And I asked Chat, I said, well, how might that look if I tried to incorporate it into the podcast episodes? And so, Chat gave me some ideas of how I could, like I said, do like a little segment or bring it in some way. And it was feeling weird. And so I said to Chat, I said, I sort of feel like that would be pushing it in front of people who are not interested in that content. Like that's not what they're here for. And it just doesn't feel right. And I said, is there any way or do you have any suggestions of how I could do something that's maybe tied to the podcast, but separate enough that people can make the choice whether or not they're interested in that content or not, and they can watch it or not. And, that's where the Faith and Focus podcast came from because Chat suggested it as kind of like a companion podcast that I could do where the things that I would have wanted to say about the topic that I was covering in the TSA Weekly podcast, that I would have wanted to bring my faith in, wanted to bring in Bible verses or things that God had been teaching me in a certain area, instead of doing that in a segment, do it in a separate podcast that, was released on a different day maybe, although that came later. If you've been around since I started Faith and Focus, you might notice that the timing of things has shifted a little bit. And also I didn't used to allow YouTube to notify my subscribers of the Faith and Focus episodes. And that I kind of shifted was that after the first season? I guess it was after the first season, I kind of moved some things around because I felt like, well, there's a difference between being respectful and separating the content and hiding the content. And I didn't want it to feel like I was hiding the content. So I separated it. And I think once or twice Faith and Focus has had its own somewhat separate topic, but usually I'm talking about the same type of thing that I was covering in TSA Weekly, but from a biblical perspective. And so they are released in the same week. And I always have them tie back to each other in the end screen here. When I show you like, here's another video you might like, it always points to the companion podcast episode. And that's a very intentional choice that I made. And I did that because I want to talk to you. I want to talk to my Christian entrepreneur family and community in a very raw and unfiltered kind of way, but at the same time, not be off-putting to people who just don't share my beliefs, or maybe they do, they just don't want it involved in what they're learning on the business side. And I got to tell you, even with the Faith and Focus podcast, even though this one is about my beliefs and it is about my faith, it's not about my politics and it's not about social causes. And that's why you don't hear me talking about that stuff here either. Even though you're here for a faith-centered conversation, it's faith and business, not faith and politics, not faith and social causes, faith and business. And that's what you're going to see here, because that's what you came for. I don't make assumptions that just because you share my faith that we agree on everything. So I'm curious, first off, I don't know if your faith is kind of in the forefront of your business or if it's more behind the scenes the way that mine was for a long time. And no judgment either way. Like, you are called to do what you are called to do, and I think that's awesome. But I'm curious how your faith shows up and if you've ever felt the same internal struggle that I have over the last 5-6 years, when so many people, especially small business owners, are putting their beliefs in the forefront when it doesn't really belong there. Like, do you feel like I have, where it felt a little bit weird? Like, am I just trying to avoid talking about it? Am I trying to avoid being canceled? Am I trying to protect myself? Or am I just respecting the fact that it's not my place? That's not what people are here for. I'm not an expert in any of these fields. It's just my beliefs. And so I feel like it's not my place. So I'm just curious if you go through the same things in your business and how you handle it. Let me know in the comments. I hope that this episode inspired and encouraged you. And if it did, please share it with a fellow Christian business owner who might need the same encouragement. Thanks for being here, and God bless.